Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Yvette Rubidoux, and I'm the Vice President for Research and Director of the Policy Research Center at the National Congress of American Indians. Welcome to our webinar series today. Today we're focusing on the U.S. Census Bureau Tribal Consultation on Differential Privacy and Access to American Indian and Alaska Native Data, and we're so glad you joined us today. And I encourage you to watch for our webinar series. We try to hold them monthly, and they focus on how data informs policy and feature a variety of topics and various guest speakers from time to time. I encourage you to join our listserv for announcements by emailing research@ncai.org. We will also announce our webinars on Twitter and our website. And if you missed any of our webinars, the recordings are usually available on our NCAI YouTube page or on our website, www.ncai.org/PRC under Events and Webinars. So here is an overview of today's agenda. I just provided a welcome, and our speakers today are me and Dr. Randall Akey, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow, Economic Studies Program, Brookings Institution, and Associate Professor, Department of Public Policy and American Indian Studies, the University of California, Los Angeles. And once we're done with the short presentation, we'll reserve plenty of time for questions at the end. And we really want this to be a webinar where people have a chance to ask questions. And so before we get started, I would like to review with you a couple of housekeeping items and know how you can participate in today's webinar event. So on this slide is a depiction of the GoToWebinar attendee interface, and it's made up of two parts, the viewer window on the left, which displays the presentations, and the control panel on the right. I'll quickly navigate how to use the control panel so you can readily participate in today's web event. By clicking the orange arrow, you can open and close your control panel. And then by the next area is where you can find all the information about the audio connection, and we recommend dialing in via phone rather than the computer, as it tends to limit feedback. And to dial in, you will find a number and an access code. The ones on the screen are incorrect, just examples, along with your unique audio PIN. And as you can see, we have all attendees currently muted and in listen-only mode. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to open up for Q&A or questions and answers. And at this time, please submit your questions by writing them in the question pane. And as a reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and after the event, you'll receive an email with a link to a short evaluation. And then when the recording is available, we'll post it on our NCAI YouTube page and our Policy Research Center website in a couple of days. Okay, so now we're going to start with a short presentation, and then please write down your questions so that you can write those in the questions pane, and we'll answer those questions through the rest of the call. All right, today we're talking about differential privacy and the U.S. Census. And as you know, there's a tribal consultation on that right now, and there was a webinar about a week ago, and it's a complicated topic. So what we're going to do today is sort of go over the timeline of how this topic came to be important for tribal nations, and then we'll describe a little bit about what the Census Bureau is looking for and what this topic is, and then we'll welcome questions. So we at NCAI first became aware of this issue in the spring of 2019. We heard from some people that the U.S. Census Bureau is planning to implement something called differential privacy and use that method to protect the confidentiality of participants in the 2020 census. They were saying that, you know, the old ways of protecting wouldn't work now that we have big data and computers that can identify people readily. We also heard that as a result of the U.S. Census Bureau planning to implement this differential privacy method to protect confidentiality, that some American Indian Alaska Native summary tables might not be publicly available as a result. And given that census data is really important to tribal nations and American Indians, Alaska Natives in general, because we're counted and visible because of it, but also it's used for a lot of things like funding formulas and tribal planning and so on. NCAI, we immediately convened a group of demographers, statisticians, and sort of super census data users to try to figure out what this differential privacy was and why it was going to have such a negative effect on the American Indian Alaska Native data tables. In July, we sent a letter to as a result of this group, which is really the lead force in this group has been Randy Aki, and I'm very grateful to him for his help with the group, and really grateful to all the members of the group. We decided to help inform NCAI to send a letter to the U.S. Census Bureau Director requesting immediate and formal tribal consultation. In August, fortunately, the U.S. Census Bureau did initiate a tribal consultation on, as they said in their letter, proposed 2020 census data products and the 2020 disclosure avoidance system, which was implementing differential privacy. And then the U.S. Census Bureau also met with our data user group by a webinar and talked about the uncertainty about what census data products would be published based on the implementation of differential privacy methods to protect confidentiality. And we learned at that time it's basically a balance between confidentiality and privacy versus accuracy. And so then we made a big point about the fact that census data is used in federal funding formulas and federal decision making and policy making. And so fortunately, the U.S. Census Bureau was able to hold a webinar on September 4th with our group and called all federal agencies to send people to be on the call. And the focus was to learn which federal formulas used decennial census data for American Indian Alaska Native services and funding. So there were several federal agency representatives on the call who were recommending or saying which formulas they use that use data from the every 10-year census or decennial census. And that webinar was actually, it was transcribed, and that's available through D. Alexander in the Census Bureau, if you're interested in hearing that conversation. Then the U.S. Census Bureau held a national informational webinar last week on 9/25 with tribes, or was that 2 weeks ago? 2 weeks ago, with tribal nations to provide an update on the consultation on differential privacy and data products. And during that call, they requested that tribes submit what data tables and products of the Census Bureau are really important to them. And so it's October now, and we're having this webinar today to answer any questions people might have about this really complex topic. And then there are 2 tribal consultation sessions coming up, one at AFN on October 16th, the Alaska Federation of Natives Conference, and then one at the NCAI Annual Convention on October 21st from 9 to 11 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So the issues for the tribal consultation are, one, understanding what differential privacy is and what its impact might be on the 2020 census data. And as I said before, more privacy protection ends up meaning less accurate data, especially for small and rural and remote populations. They're impacted the most. And so as a result, since that data is less accurate, they're not going to make certain data tables public like they did in the past. And there's a question of whether some of the American Indian Alaska Native summary tables will be publicly available or not. The U.S. Census Bureau really needs to hear from Indian country, and their question is, what data tables do you need to use that are critical, because that helps them figure out how much privacy protection they need to do. And I just want to make one more point, which is this is about the Decennial Census, which is a 2020 census, which is done every 10 years. And the ACF data is not impacted until 2025. So now I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Randall Akey, who will complete the presentation, and then we'll take questions.
Hi, can you hear me? Am I coming through?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Hi, this is Randy Akey. So just to recap, the Decennial Census, it happens every 10 years, and it provides a count of individuals and households living in the U.S. every 10 years. And it has, it's been determined and established in the U.S. Constitution that this is the process by which legislative districts, the number of representatives by state for the House of Representatives, are determined. Additionally, the population counts that come out of this are used in a number of different policy and funding formula decisions, research, advocacy work by nonprofits, tribal organizations, tribal governments, and academics. And the way the census is enumerated is that people are either mailed, they're called, or they are emailed the link to filling out the census, and it asks for one person in each household to fill out a form, again by phone or online. It really asks for a small amount of information. Really, it's approximately 10 questions. It's the number of people living in the house, the age, the race, ethnicity, and gender of all those individuals, their relationship to the head of household, whether the house itself is rented or owned, and all of the other things that we typically think are collected by the U.S. Census actually comes through the ACS, the American Community Survey, which happens annually, and that's a survey of somewhere between 2 to 3% of the population each year, and that asks questions such as educational attainment, people's incomes, people's commuting times to work, country of origin, a lot of really detailed questions, but that's not captured in the Decennial Census. The implementation of differential privacy, Dr. Rubidoux has discussed earlier, is intended to protect confidentiality, but it comes at some cost, and the cost might be accuracy at some levels of geographic units in tables and data provided. And that's where the concern comes in, and whether there are certain things that must be produced in order for continued advocacy, research, population counts for certain communities, for certain nations, for certain peoples. And that's where the Census Bureau has been sort of most explicit that they need to know what the content, what the kinds of tables, what levels of geography, what levels of disaggregation are sort of utmost importance, and for what purposes. And specifically, if there are federal mandates or requirements for that type of data. And that's why they're requesting input onto the data that tribes need and use, and because that will help them determine the levels of differential privacy and the way in which it'll be allocated across different types of tables and data sets that are released in the future. Okay, next slide, please. So again, the sort of speaking about differential privacy, again, the idea is that it's intended to add additional noise to various different types at various levels in the standard tables that are produced. So if, for instance, there were 10 individuals of a certain age, of a certain race, in a specific geographic unit like census tract or census block, the noise would not identify 10 people, but would randomly add, 3 more people, or reduce that number by 3 people, for instance. And that's sort of needed because with the ability to link to third-party data or other commercial data or other online data sources, it's becoming increasingly easy or feasible to identify people by race and ethnic group, and ultimately by overall sort of individual characteristics. As a result, that's what differential privacy is intended to prevent, so that some tables have to, by design, become less accurate, or they need to be sort of suppressed and not made publicly available for the public to use any further. And we've had, as Dr. Rubido has mentioned, a couple of webinars with the U.S. Census Bureau, and they provided some information on the tables and the levels of geography that would be probably most likely persist and continue, and the levels at which, below which it would be probably not feasible for them to present tables. And there was leeway, and it does seem to sound that there is leeway for certain allowances in the case where certain types of data are absolutely crucial in the analysis or advocacy work or funding requests that are crucial to tribal communities and tribal nations, and that's where the requirement or the real sort of push to identify these data will have an impact on how differential privacy is applied to the 2020 census. And so, as a result, it's really going to be very helpful if tribal nations can identify throughout their administration, throughout their agencies and other work employees, as well as organizations, advocacy groups that they work with and partner with, to identify which tables are the most crucial and are foundational in for their work. And again, as another important thing would be to be able to attend these and participate in these tribal consultations and give feedback to the Census Bureau so they understand that it's not just a small group of individuals, it actually is every single tribal nation, as well as responding directly to the Census Bureau's tribal consultation letter. Next slide, please. Right. And so just to summarize, the reason for us doing this webinar is to help answer any questions that may exist with regard to differential privacy and the 2020 census, to the extent that we can answer them from our experiences working with the Census Bureau and attending several of the census webinars, both in person and online. Just to hopefully put out more information so that more informed conversations can be had. And I think that's the next slide, and we're ready for question and answers.
Great, thank you so much. So now we'll take time to answer some of the questions you have. Please write them in the questions pane on the GoToWebinar interface, and we will answer any questions you have at all, as much as we can. We're not representing the Census Bureau at all. It's just NCAI and Randy.
Definitely.
It's just us trying to help answer any questions you might have, because this is such a, I don't know, it's kind of a strange topic, but it's a very complicated topic. But as we wait for a question from the audience, please write your questions. No question is a stupid question. We just definitely want to know what more you want to learn about this topic. So we have a question. The first one is, has there been oversampling of American Indians and Alaska Natives for the census historically? Will these changes impact these efforts moving forward?
So I'll try to take a stab at that. Well, in terms of the census is intended to enumerate and count everybody. So by virtue of the census activities, there's not technically an oversample because it's not a sampling at all. So it's intended to capture and write down and sort of accurately depict the entire population of the United States at that time period. So it's a snapshot event. So in theory, it is supposed to capture everyone. The American Community Surveys, which are done annually, are a sample. They're a survey, or a subsample of the population. Again, somewhere between 2 to 3% of the population each year. And it's my understanding that there isn't an oversample for that. That is proportionate and conducted with, and a lot of the parameters and the methods for sampling are based, I believe, on the creation, the population as determined by the census. So the census goes into many things, the population count, but it also is the sampling frame for the next decade, for instance.
Yeah, and I'll just comment
that answers the question. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'll just comment also that, so, for the census every 10 years, there's always a lot of efforts to try to convince people to actually complete the census. And so NCAI has an Indian Country Counts initiative. If you go to indiancountrycounts.org, you can find what some of those efforts are. And right now we're giving mini grants to tribes to help develop a plan for your community. But yeah, the 2020 or decennial census is a complete count of, and there have to be extra efforts for American Indians and Alaska Natives to make sure that they participate. And then if a lot of American Indians and Alaska Natives participate, we certainly want to have access to that data. And so that brings us back to sort of this conversation, which is the data tables that you're used to seeing for American Indian data might not be available depending on how much privacy protections are implemented by the Census Bureau. So that's why we need everybody to think about what census tables from the 2010 census did you use, and what kind of data are you going to need moving forward. And since the questions are not that complicated, it's like the count of population counts, by age, by gender, housing data, those kinds of things. So it's that's the kind of data that we're wondering whether you use or not. The second question is, I'm not familiar with the census tables that may be used. Can you elaborate, please? And Randy, I don't know if you can recall the tables that they said might be impacted versus the ones that might be not impacted.
Sure. So the Census Bureau puts out millions of census tables with each decennial census, and so there are specific ones that are done for the AIAN population. It's called Summary File AIAN, and in that summary file, there's just a significant number of tables that provide information on the count of the population by age, by gender, by race, by various geographic units. So from state to county to census tract to census block, also at the reservation level, also at there are other geographic units. So those are all the kinds of potential things that may be affected, and one can look at them online at census.gov, the American Fact Finder website, which provides most, if not all, of the available census tables that are publicly available, and that's where the true question comes in: what are the standard tables that are used, and what are the kinds of characteristics that are needed at, for instance, the tribal level versus the county level, or the census tract level versus the census block level, which are all different. They're all sort of, some of these geographic measures are sort of hierarchical, and they're all housed within each other, and some of them are just parallel systems of geographic units, like tribal statistical areas and reservation level areas. And so these are the questions that So the answer is that there are essentially variations on these different variables: age, gender, types of housing units occupied, and across the different geographic units. And so they put out quite a lot of combinations of these tables, again, combining age by gender, by race, by different geographic units. And so that's where a lot of information used to be publicly available. To some extent, that still will be the case. And the Census Bureau is now offering up, trying to make some decisions on where the cutting will be, which level, which types, which areas will it hold back on providing information because of the privacy issues regarding that have now become potentially problematic, and that's sort of where it's coming from. So, I guess again, the answer to your question is that there are multiple tables that are provided by the Census Bureau resulting from decennial censuses, and they can be found online, and they often are presented as a combination of different types of variables and different types of geographic units. Hope that
So I'm going to try to also explain it in a different way. Let's say you're a tribe and you have 1,000 people in your tribe, and your tribal land, it's not real large, but it goes over, a couple of census tracts, but it's all in one county. And so let's say your tribe normally would use the population estimates from the census to figure out how many American Indians and Alaska Natives live in those census tracts that align with your tribal land. And then sometimes you'll take that count of the number of American Indians and then want to know how many are male or female, and want to know how many are in up to 10 age categories. Because your tribe is small, if it has 1,000 people, the census first, I think, doesn't give any counts under 100. But let's say if you, look at 10 age categories of those 1,000 people, then you're getting into some really small numbers in the table, and it might be possible that someone could take other data and figure out who these people are based on the residence or whatever. And so the U.S. Census Bureau is saying, in order to protect privacy, some of those tables that you normally use to look at your population in terms of numbers or gender or age or housing might not be available anymore because it's risky to, they could be identified. And implementing the privacy method, the differential privacy, will jumble things too much up for those tables to be useful to your tribe. And so what the Census Bureau needs to know is what sort of tables are you using now, or what data or information are you using now related to the population count and demographics such as age or gender or housing numbers. What kind of information do you need as a tribe to make sure that you can still do what you're doing locally for planning and policy making decisions? And I don't know if that was the right way to describe that, Randy. You can correct me, but
no, I think that sounds right.
Okay. So the next question is, are tribes that are not federally recognized placed in a different category, and how are these tribes and members counted? And the answer to that is everybody living in the U.S. has the potential to be counted in the U.S. Census. They just have to complete the census. It doesn't have anything to do with whether they're federally recognized or not, because the question that the census asks is, are you, sort of in one of the racial categories defined by OMB? So are you American Indian, Alaska Native? And then there's a section where you can write in your principal tribe or tribes, but there's no place where they actually ask about federally recognized or not. It depends on how the person answers that question. If they do say they're American Indian Alaska Native and they do write in a tribe, then people could figure out whether it's federally recognized or not. But that's not really the purpose. The purpose of the census is just to count everybody and look at the results by race, ethnicity, and age and gender and housing characteristics. So I hope that answers your question. The next question is, what are the common uses of census data for funding purposes, and do they all use the same information in their calculations, or do they use different ones? And so this was a interesting conversation in that meeting on September 4th with the funding agencies. Now, I know from having been with the Indian Health Service, there's a lot of use of population counts and census data to not only describe the service area and service area of the Indian Health Service, but also to use in some of its funding formulas. And I was looking at Trends in Indian Health, which is a publication that they put out and that they use, described how census tract data is a part of the calculation for defining the service population. And if the differential privacy method were implemented as they're saying it might be, census tract data might not be available publicly. It might be at the place level, which is a little bit higher than census tract. So, I also know that tribes use census data to help apply for federal grants and for planning purposes. And so as a result, we want to make sure that all tribes have that data available, but the Census Bureau needs to understand how tribes use the decennial census data, the every 10-year census data, and the population estimates that come from it to do the things they need to do for their tribal governance, but also how the federal agencies use it and whether this differential privacy thing is going to impact the ability of them to use this data for those funding formulas. Hopefully that was helpful. The next question is, what do you think tribes should say in the consultation sessions? I think you mean the ones at AFN and NCAI. I think that the U.S. Census Bureau is hoping that tribes come prepared to talk about how they use the decennial census data in their governance and planning. I think the problem with that is that this is a complicated topic, and not everybody knows immediately which census data table they use. So we have been encouraging tribes to talk to their planning offices or their research offices or their housing offices about what kind of data do you use locally from the census, so that the tribes can comment in the consultation. But the NCAI Policy Research Center, we also recently published a research update on this topic. The link to it is in our Twitter feed, or else you can go to our publications page on our website. And we have listed out some recommendations of some comments that tribes can make. Certainly as tribal nations, we would want to make sure that data is available for tribal governance, but we also want the data to be protected, and we want to ensure that both of those things are available as much as possible. And so you can look at that data brief for some recommendations about what tribes can say at the consultation, but we definitely want tribes to also come with questions about this issue and ask them to explain more about it so that there's a meaningful consultation. And that's the thing, is tribal consultation is supposed to be meaningful. So that means you have to be able to clearly understand the topic before going to the tribal consultation, and the Census Bureau has to clearly explain it and what the issues are that they want tribes to comment on. And the big thing they're saying is they want tribes to describe how they use census data in their local governance, or are they aware of how it's used in funding formulas so that they can make a determination of how much privacy protections to put in place, or whether they need to find alternatives for tribal governments in this situation. So without telling exactly what to say, I would say read our research update, and that has some suggested things that you can say in the tribal consultation. But I encourage you to go, encourage your tribes to go. If you're a technical person, make sure you get your tribal leader all oriented and have talking points for them for the consultation, because the Census Bureau really does need to get input from tribes. We have another question. It says, in response to your question, as a Native researcher, I do use census data for a lot of my health disparities work as reference points, especially as related to social determinants of health. Losing data specific to American Indian Alaska Natives would impact my work a lot. And yeah, I think that's a big concern we have, is if we don't have certain data tables that people need, that would impact people's work. Randy, I don't know if you want to comment a little bit about how the loss of data tables might impact people or researchers.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we all come at it from different aspects. Some as researchers, some as advocates, community advocates, some as tribal, leaders and tribal governments, and all have different uses of data. And I think we all collectively and individually have to make our voices heard on this, about the ways in which you, either as an individual researcher or as part of a community group or advocacy group or tribal nation, use data for whatever aspects: work, advocacy, planning, submitting of grants, funding formula. I think the more the merrier in this case. And so, if you're able to respond to the U.S. Census Bureau's, requests for comments, I think, again, the more the merrier, and talking about the ways in which and the kinds of data that you use, that will have an impact and hopefully have an impact on making sure that this data continues to be made available to some extent in the future.
I think I also remember that, the decision that they make on the level of privacy protection is going to be set for forever on this data set. So
yeah,
it might turn out. Go ahead.
That's exactly right, Yvette. That's exactly right. It's a one-time level of privacy that will be determined, and which means that a set amount of tables and data will be able to be released, and it's not as if additional data will be able to be released, at least not until 72 years later. That's sort of the current time period, where beyond 72 years, the full census can be microdata can be released. That's sort of been the process up until now. But in the short run, that information, whatever the level of confidentiality and the level of censoring of tables and figures, that will be in place at least until the full release, which happens decades and decades later.
Yeah, so any uses of the data that people need for this 2020 census data, we need that input to the U.S. Census Bureau, because if it's not factored in right now, it may never be available, which is kind of scary a little bit. One of the issues I wanted to bring up was how important geography is. So in addition to people figuring out what kind of census data that they need locally with their tribe or in their research. It's also at what level of geography do people need their data. So do tribes use census data that is at the, for example, block level or the census tract level or the county level or the place level? Because they're saying now that right now the differential privacy is going to be applied and that data will be public down to the place level, which means that levels below that won't be available, such as census tract and that sort of thing. But I have a feeling a lot of tribes use data by census tract. So that's one important issue to consider about this. Is, what sort of level is the data being used by tribes or researchers? And like I said before, I think census tract data helps inform the IHS service population, so I don't know how they're going to handle that. That's an important thing to go back to a tribe and say, at what level of data are we using to, understand our tribal population, to make counts for decision making, things like that. I want to remind the audience that if you have a question, please write it in the question pane, and we will try to answer it as the best we can. I also encourage you to, when the webinar is available from the Census Bureau from September 4th, I would encourage you to watch that webinar. You can kind of fast forward through the part where they talk about prior census activities and updates and get to the part to where they talk about the different data tables. And so, for example, for those of you who might be data nerds, the American Indian Alaska Native Summary Table 1 seems like it might be available, but the Summary Table 2 probably won't. And then there's a couple other tables that people use that might not be available, and they have to figure out something to do that's different. The other thing is we're small, American Alaska Native tribes in some cases are small populations that will be more impacted by this, but there's also other small populations like Pacific Islanders and rural and remote communities that might be impacted as well. So we just happen to have the leverage of being able to have a tribal consultation about it, but those populations are also at risk as well in a time when we're talking about needing more data disaggregation to help understand health disparities and understand areas of need. Again, write your questions in the questions pane. See if we get any more questions. Feel free, this is your chance to ask questions about this topic. We'll give people a minute or two more or a couple of minutes to ask questions. Oh, let's see. Let's see if we get one or two more questions. I guess we could end early if that's the only questions we have. Again, no question is a stupid question. You're thinking of a question. Someone else probably is. Again, it took a while to understand what differential privacy does. And what it does is it basically, the more privacy protection, the more inaccurate the data gets, especially in small numbers and at smaller or more remote geographies. And so that's why American Indians and Alaska Natives are impacted more by this. We have another question. It says, who are the best people on tribal staff to ask about which tables are being used? So most tribes usually have a planning department or an evaluation department or a research department or even the health department. Those are good places to start. The housing department for sure, since housing data is a part of the 2020 census. If anybody else has suggestions, just write them in the question pane. The next question is, where on the NCAI Policy Research Center website can you find the documents you mentioned? So you can go to one of two places. If you go to www.ncai.org/PRC and you look at the top bar, there's one that says Research Recommendations. And if you click on that, you'll see the letter that we wrote to the U.S. Census Bureau along with their, I think we also have information on the consultation, their letter. And then if you go to the NCAI Policy Research Center website again, and then you go to the front page and there's a tab that says Research and Data. If you click on the Research and Data tab, there'll be something that says PRC Publications. If you scroll down, you'll find the recent research update on differential privacy. And it's also on our Twitter feed from a tweet about 2 weeks ago. So if you have trouble finding those, just email research@ncai.org and we can send them to you, send the link to you. We also have a listserv. If you want to join that, just send research@ncai.org an email. We'll add you to that. So the next question is, when are the comments due? I'm on the website looking for that. Well, it turns out they didn't put a deadline in the letter for the comments, but I assume they're going to want the comments by the end of the year because the consultations are in October. And Randy, do you recall when they're going to make the decision on the level of differential privacy that they're going to implement?
I don't remember them saying anything about the final deadline for the level of privacy. It seemed to, I think all of us attending the webinars and in person and on the phone, that the sooner the better, because it will really sort of reserve a place or reserve, it'll be in people's minds sooner rather than later. So if there are any tables or figures or things that are used, and even if it's not complete, I think my suggestion would be to submit that now and then do follow-ups if there are subsequent figures, tables, data that you realize that you or others in your organizations use. But if you know there are at least one or two right away, I would submit more than once, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really important to get information and to submit comments to this consultation. I think I recall someone saying something about they want to make the decision by the time they start the census, which is in April.
Could be.
Which kind of makes a little bit of sense since they're now starting data collection, but that's pretty soon. That's like in, 6 months. Yeah. So everybody should get their comments in as quickly as they can. All right. Let's see if we have any more comments. Please write your questions in the question pane. Another question came up on another forum about would it be possible if the data tables are not public for tribes to have special access to the data that's not protected by the differential privacy protections? And Randy, do you have an answer on that one?
So I don't know conclusively, but it seems like nothing will be released. Anything that goes out publicly is part of will have to take up part of the privacy budget. So under differential privacy, there will be a total amount of privacy loss allowed. That number, that figure will be determined, and then tables will be allowed after that. So anything that individuals want to, communities, organizations, tribal governments, my understanding is that it could be applied. You could apply and look at it, in a confidential setting, but I'm not so sure how useful that would be if that was needed for planning purposes, because those numbers, those figures, couldn't be taken out of the Census Bureau. So you could, I think, technically look at that if you got the proper clearance and authority. So the accurate data will always exist and reside at the Census Bureau. So it's not as if it doesn't exist. It's just that it won't be cleared for dissemination. And by dissemination, I mean, number one, public tables, and number two, for use in grant applications or advocacy work or other sorts of things. So I think for all intents and purposes, it essentially means that the data will be there, but for practical use, if it's being held back, I suppose tribal governments can, and even individual researchers can request to go and view the confidential use data. There are processes for that already that exist. However, it's not. I don't think it's a guarantee that the researcher or the government official will be able to use that information anywhere outside the census. But that is something that would have to be really nailed down with Census Bureau officials. But my sense is that wouldn't be the case. But again, that's where the census would have to answer on that directly. And I don't think they have addressed this issue either. We've talked about it a little bit as researchers, but it's not my sense that anything has been formalized.
Thank you for that. And, I think a lot of tribal planners might be used to just going to the census website and going to the American Community Finder or going to my tribal area and getting data and using that in, all kinds of things in grant applications, in their local planning efforts, and those kinds of things. But it's possible that might not be available moving forward. So that's why this is particular consultation and making sure that tribes give input is really important. All right, and the last question is, please send information from whom to send the comments to. So Dee Alexander is the person who is collecting the comments. She's the tribal affairs person with the U.S. Census Bureau. And so there is an actual letter to Dear Tribal Leader letter that went to tribes, and it has the contact information in that letter. And we posted it on Twitter, and I think it's on our website somewhere, but we'll make it more obvious where that letter is and all the materials with it. So I want to thank everybody on the phone for their questions. They were really good, and I hope that this webinar at least is helping you see how not only complicated but important this topic is. So we hope that you can help advise tribes on their comments that they'll submit to the U.S. Census Bureau as part of the tribal consultation. But I also hope you all can think about your use of the census data and whether loss of access to some of the summary tables and some of the data tables might impact what you do. And so now that we're getting close to the end of the hour, I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Randy Akey, for his willingness to join us today. He's been really essential in helping us try to understand this topic and helping us try to find a way forward to encourage the Census Bureau to do the tribal consultation. And then they did, and then now we're just trying to figure out ways to explain this so that tribes can have a meaningful consultation with the U.S. Census Bureau and make sure everybody knows it's critical that they give input. And I'd like to thank everybody else who joined us today. You will receive a follow-up email after this webinar that will have a evaluation form, and we hope that you'll be able to fill that out. And we have recorded this webinar, and we'll post it soon on our website and send it out on Twitter. So if you're able to, if you know people who should have been on here or should learn about this topic, please refer them to this webinar and the webinar that'll come out in the transcript from the U.S. Census Bureau from their webinar on September 25th. And once we get a hold of that, we'll send that out on our social media as well. I have just a couple announcements before we leave today. Watch for announcements about this webinar series. We try to do them monthly, and watch for announcements for the next topic on our website, on Twitter, on our listserv. Tomorrow we have a cool one on opioid data tools, so I hope you can join us for that. If you're not on our listserv, email research@ncai.org and we can add you. And we've included oops, something happened here. Let me get the last slide up again. There we go. We've included our website and our Twitter handle so that you can know where to get announcements. And we have the webinar tomorrow at 3 o'clock as well on the opioid data tool. Make sure you register for that one and look on our website for the information. I'd also encourage you to visit our NCAI Policy Research Center website. We have PowerPoint presentations from last year's Tribal Leaders Scholar Forum. We have several new publications, including the one that summarizes differential privacy, and a couple of the letters we've written on the research recommendations page. And save the date. I hope you can join us for the NCAI Annual Convention and Marketplace in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And that's coming up in just less than 2 weeks. October 20th to 25th, and the consultation on this topic is on the morning of October 21st. We're developing a great agenda and hope to see you all there. And if you would like to register and attend, you can go to www.ncai.org. And so again, thank you all so much for attending the webinar today. I hope it's been helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.